These are Nebraska corn farmers. They work in acres, not hours, harvesting the energy and climate solutions the world needs. We are proud to stand with you.
The success of tomorrow's soy industry depends on the actions we take today. The future is here, and the time to move is now.
Market Journal, Television for Agricultural Business Decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources in partnership with the Nebraska Rural Radio Association. Promotional support provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine and partial funding provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Well, hi everyone, I'm Bryce, and thank you very much for joining us today here on Market Journal. We are joining you from the Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory Open House, which is taking place this week in the middle of the week near Whitman, Nebraska. This week we'll be bringing you some of the best advice when it comes to livestock management right here from this event. Coming up a little bit later on the show, we'll get an in-depth look at what's happening in the cattle markets with the university's Elliott Dennis, as well as get a long-term weather outlook as the fall harvest is approaching with Market Journal's Chief Meteorologist Eric Hunt. But we'll start with an update from the Farm Service Agency. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is accepting offers for more than 2.2 million acres from agricultural producers and private landowners through this year's Grassland General and Continuous Conservation Reserve Program signups administered by USDA's Farm Service Agency. With these accepted acres, enrollment is very near the 27 million CRP acreage cap, including the nearly 1.44 million acres recently accepted into the Grassland CRP offers received in 2024. Producers will have enrolled in more than 10 million acres into this program. Grassland CRP allows for producers and landowners to continue to graze in hay while also protecting grasslands and furthering CRP's impact. Grassland CRP leverages working lands practices to improve biodiversity and conserve environmentally sensitive land. Through this program, enrolled acres help sequester carbon in vegetation and soil while also enhancing resilience to drought and wildfire. Meanwhile, producers can still conduct common grazing practices such as haying, mowing, or harvesting seed from the enrolled land, which supports agricultural production. Now, producers can still make an offer to participate in CRP through the continuous CRP signup, which is ongoing. You can do so by contacting FSA at their local USDA service center. If you'd like some additional information, we've included that along with a helpful link along with this story. Find that over on the Market Journal homepage. But back to today's event. As I mentioned earlier, we are broadcasting from the Sandhills of Nebraska at the Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory Open House, and this year happens to be the 25th year of the event taking place. In that time, research and management practices, they've continued to change quite a bit. However, this facility has an interesting history that predates the beginning of the annual field day where we're at today. We sat down with Extension Educator Veski to learn more about the humble beginnings of this facility and how it's continued to evolve over the years. Well, Jerry, thank you very much for sitting down with us here. We sure appreciate the hospitality and you doing so. This is the 25th anniversary of the field day, but this research site has been around a bit longer than that, correct?
That's right. The Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory was officially, donated to the University of Nebraska Foundation in 1981. And it was Pete and Abby Gudmundsen who were the owners, and they were operating the place as a working ranch. So after 1981, the foundation, working with the University of Nebraska, began their development of the place as a research facility, started doing, having different faculty come out, all with the focus of beef cattle and rangeland and grazing land research.
This is a long ways away from Lincoln, and I think the locals will tell you that's a good thing because things look a little different in the Sandhills compared to Lincoln. To that point, why is it important to have this site available for researchers to do things like you've done, is take a look at various projects?
Sure. Well, the faculty that come from that do work out here either come from Lincoln on campus, or like myself, I'm at North Platte at the Research and Extension Center there. Likewise, there's faculty at Scotts Bluff at the Panhandle Center that have, over the years, all have been involved in in research here at the Gudmundsen. And primary objective has been to that focus on beef cattle research, beef cattle systems, and all with the overall goal of learning more about beef production in the Sandhills, and then ultimately, of course, transferring some of that knowledge to the producers, to the landowners, to how to, be more sustainable in what they do, more profitable in what they do is a big part of it.
What kind of projects have you been part of?
Well, so myself, over the years, on the range and forage side of things, I've been mostly involved with different grazing management types of studies, specifically looking at how some of the impacts of the different timing and degree of utilization of these native sandhills grasses affects them. And from that, coming up with recommendations or plans, I guess you would call them, on how to best graze those upland sandhills native range. Then I've also done a number of different things on the subirrigated meadows here in the Sandhills, which meadows traditionally have been a primary source of hay, but in some cases people do utilize or do graze those. And so we studied grazing on these meadows quite a bit to see how that is impacting those meadows.
How have you seen things change from the early days of this laboratory to what it is today?
Sure. Over the years, I think, when things first got started, there was a lot of work by some of the animal science faculty and economics faculty related to more of the nutritional aspects of the range beef cow. There was a lot of emphasis for a number of years on the calving date or calving season and how changing that might alter the whole system. And so some of the work that was done in that area was really, I think, just outstanding and has really made a big impact to livestock producers across the state.
I mentioned the locals, so to speak, the ranchers who call this area the state home. How important is it to have them out here once a year and to, as well, get their buy-in of the research projects happening at Gudmundsen?
Well, sure, that's very important. Gudmundsen is kind of, to a lot of people, out in the middle of nowhere, but it's really a community. But it's a big community extending over miles and miles in terms of the local neighboring ranchers, and we do have a lot of people come in, and it's the 25th year continuously that we've had, or annually now, that we've had an open house here. There were a few others back in the 80s and early 90s, but it's just been a kind of thing, something that the local ranchers look forward to each year, to come here to GSL, interact with some of their friends and neighbors, but also, like you said, the very important part of this is to learn about some of the current research activities that are taking place.
Well, Jerry, thanks for sitting down with us. Fun to hear a little bit about the history of this impressive laboratory.
You bet. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate Jerry joining us to give us some of the insights on the history of the nearly 13,000 acres of working land that they're able to do research on near Whitman. Now, one of the topics of discussion that has been a big one here is rangeland management, as managers continue to have a unique understanding of how rangeland management practices continue to impact the communities around here, as well as soil health. We're able to catch up with UNL Range and Forage Management Specialist, that is Dr. Mitch Stevenson, to find out all about what he shared as part of his presentation here at the open house. It's not just about the rangeland studies, but also some different research they can do with the cattle that occupy that land. Well, Mitch, I'm curious to learn about some of the research you've done as part of your time with the University of Nebraska out here at the Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory, in particular over the past couple of years. What have you been busy with?
Such a great resource out here to do research on. It's just such a pleasure to be out here able to test some of these things. And so we've had a few different projects that have happened over the last few years that have revolved around precision livestock management, evaluating some grazing strategies on subirrigated sandhills meadows, and then tracking the long-term plant biomass with our long-term grazing exposure cages. And so the precision livestock management work that we've done out here has revolved mostly around virtual fence. So really that technology has been around for quite a while, since the early 2000s. There's some research papers that have talked about it, but at a commercial scale for cattle, it's really just coming onto the market where people can purchase these collars at larger numbers. And so we've been doing some research in that space for a couple of years now, looking at its efficacy, but also evaluating things on how does this affect cattle stress, how does this affect where they graze, and how that behavior happens. And we just wrapped up a study looking at heart rate, tracking the heart rate of animals as they interact with both the audio and the electric cues of those systems, those collars that they have. And we found that they were fairly effective in keeping cattle where they were at, and that once cattle really get to learn what those cues are signifying, they're able to, one, have fewer electric cues and respond more to audio cues, but two, that their heart rates, while they do elevate, typically that elevation is for a relatively short period. We generally saw 30 seconds. The longest was about 4 minutes, but that cow stayed within a electric cueing zone for a little bit longer. And so our conclusions were that it can be an effective tool to keep cattle in. It's not going to be 100% all the time. So you probably want a good perimeter fence, but that it can be effective in managing where they graze, and that the likelihood that it causes long-term stress is probably fairly low, in that cattle, once they know what that is, might have short-term elevated stress, but it goes down relatively quickly. Mm-hmm. As far as the meadow research that we've been doing up here, there's a long history of research looking at different grazing strategies on meadows and uplands here at the Gudmundsen Sandhills lab, and how to incorporate both haying and grazing within those systems. Sandhills meadows are extremely important to our ecosystem. Around 10% of the land area out here, highly productive, important for wildlife and a number of other ecosystem services. And so how do we graze those to get the most benefit from a production standpoint, but also maintain some of those ecological values that they have? And so what we were looking at is how does timing of grazing and intensity of grazing on hay meadow regrowth affect subsequent year hay production? And so we looked at a couple different grazing strategies of grazing either in the fall when grass was still green and growing, or waiting until the winter and after grass had been dormant. Then we looked at a heavy and moderate grazing intensity on that. And really what we found is that the following year, timing tended to have more of an influence than intensity of grazing. And so grazing in the fall, when grasses were still green and growing, tended to reduce subsequent year hay production by about 10% compared to waiting and grazing during the winter time after grasses had gone completely dormant. But there was some trade-offs there. Grazing in the fall, we had more biomass as well as a much higher quality of forage available. And so thinking of that in terms of those trade-offs, grazing is an important benefit in the fall and the winter, and there might be some opportunities that you can rotate that would help so you don't lose as much of that grass production later that next summer. And then lastly, our long-term biomass, we've collected data here since 2004 to basically track how different precipitation, temperature, other weather variables affect our plant production in the uplands sandhills. And so we have a pretty rich data set there. We're learning more and more about how dynamic that is going through these drought and wet cycles. As well as more and more about how the interplay between our C3 cool season grasses and our warm season grasses interact with one another in terms of certain wet years and dry year conditions. And so we continue to do that. This year, we've had decent precipitation. It's looking to be a fairly average year in terms of our production. That long-term data set's been pretty valuable in helping us understand the plant community out here better.
What's the next step after you do these kinds of research projects? And I guess kind of the question becomes, why is it important you're doing so? How can you extend that information out to the producers, a lot of them here today, that need that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we try to be is producer focused, try to get after the questions that we're getting calls about and we're getting asked about. And so we try to get this data obviously here at the open house to try to share what we're learning and to ask producers really like what are questions that you have and what better ways can we understand this.
As we continue our coverage out here near Whitman, Nebraska, it's that time of the show where we like to look at what's happening in the markets, and in this week in particular talking about the livestock markets, because we're talking cattle, of course, at the Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory. Elliott Dennis, University livestock economist, fresh off your presentation. As all the cattlemen want to know, where are the prices headed? In particular, I think as part of your discussion, you looked at the fall, because those are some of the decisions that have to be made right now. Give us your prediction. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so really I think it's kind of where the cash market's at right now, and when we're really thinking about that, it says, well, prices have been coming down a little bit. So when we think about where we're at in October, November, as we start thinking about weaning, kind of where prices could be at for both 5-6 weights and also 7-8 weights. Bulk of the presentation was on 7-8 weights for just price forecasting. And really, I kind of see that price using combination of just about 285, which would be kind of about average of where we're at if we just kind of maintain the market. But really there's this deviation. We think about kind of going into the kind of the latter part of the year. About 289 is what I would kind of was projecting there, which would be a deviation from the last year trend. Generally, we start to come down a little bit. But it's not just that price, 285 or 289. It's all where the distribution of is, or how likely are we to achieve that price. And so one of the ways that we're able to do that is we take kind of futures options data from the CME group, and we can basically make a whole bunch of assumptions and then say, okay, what does that price distribution look like? And essentially at that price, we're about 20% of the time we're going to be higher than that price. Essentially, there's a lot of downside risk in the market right now, especially being priced in on different weather events from different kind of policy decisions. And so I think even more so, even though there's optimism for prices to go up, I think there's a lot of downside risk in the market right now. And maybe we need to be thinking about kind of protecting either the LRP or futures or options in the market, even though we're optimistic about kind of where that supply situation could be.
Optimism is always a good thing at these kinds of field days and in the cattle industry broadly, but bring out the pessimism here. Why that downward pressure that you're seeing? Where's that coming from?
Yeah, really from two areas. I mean, consumer has been exceptionally resilient, and we have to have a lot of appreciation for that. If we think about like how much beef actually costs, it's almost $10 on an all fresh beef index. And so that's extremely expensive when we think about they've experienced these prices for 2 or 3 years. Consumer debt is rising, delinquency rates are up, interest rates haven't been coming down. So there's just a lot of pressure when we think about disposable income of consumers. Can they continue to support higher prices? And there is some softening in what we're seeing in some of those consumer valuations. That's the first thing. And then we think about kind of the export market. Kind of going into this fall, we're going to be entering kind of this interesting situation. China has really kind of come off the books a little bit. There's some things happening with trade negotiations. So the question is, do we go back to 2017 to values, which China was a zero trading partner? Now they're our third largest. So I think there's some of those kind of discussions starting to happen, like how much of this is going to really affect the industry? Well, if we don't need China, then maybe our supply situation is solved. So I think those two, exports and also kind of a softening domestic market, can really impact total pounds of production that we need to actually produce.
Mm-hmm. Fair points. Appreciate you bringing that up. Let's really go what's happening in the markets this week, in particular on the futures. We factor in last week's cash. Things are softening a little bit here, and there's some worry out there as you talk to people, anecdotally. As you look at what's happening, losing a few dollars, on a Tuesday here in the live and feeder cattle markets, is this perhaps just a little bit of a downward trend this week, or perhaps a sign of longer-term downward pressure?
Yeah, so I always think about a particular contract that I'm focusing on. So we think about the October contract for feeder cattle. There's going to be some situation where the price has to come and meet futures, or is futures going to come down? And I think what we're seeing is kind of both kind of markets kind of moving together. Some of that has to do with different announcements and different kind of information out there, like we're testing more for bird flu and ground beef, even though it's safe. So I think there's some of those kind of worries kind of being priced into the market right now. I think there's also a little bit uncertainty on policy-wise, kind of we're going into an election year, like what those policies could be. So I think those things are getting priced in. But overall, I mean, eventually we have to come to some sort of agreement, and that's where we have basis. I just see prices coming down a little bit, but as we mentioned before, kind of that fall outlook, I think we've kind of reached somewhat of a level of resistance, maybe plus or minus $2. But this is just my own thoughts, kind of where forecasts. Obviously, if you have other shocks or more information comes out, those forecasts are updated. But kind of see we're kind of hitting the bottom, and prices can really maintain throughout the fall.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of factors and things to be watching in the cattle industry. You make it all sound simple, so I appreciate you joining us to do so. Elliott Dennis, University of Nebraska-Lincoln livestock economist, our guest here on Market Journal. Now up next, another speaker was our very own Eric Hunt, meteorologist for Market Journal. He was on site taking a look at some of the long-range weather forecasts. We sat down with him immediately after he spoke. Here's our conversation. But look at conditions here in the Sandhills, Eric. Things are looking pretty darn good for this time of the year.
Sure. Well, it's just about as pretty as having out here just in general. But yeah, actually, I think for the most part, they had enough moisture earlier in the year. The pastures have done fairly well. I wish I could say the same thing about other parts of the state. Some areas, particularly parts of Panhandle, We've had kind of a rough last 2-3 months out there, severe drought in some places. And we've also been drying out in other parts of the state. Some parts of north central, northeastern Nebraska have been pretty dry the last 30 to 45 days, and particularly kind of down in parts of southeastern Nebraska near the Kansas border. We've really seen things go south pretty quickly here the last month or so.
Of course, the drought monitor continues to reflect that as that comes out weekly, and people taking a look at that. Were you expecting some of this dryness to happen a little bit later in the growing season as we looked at the weather patterns setting up what was going to be the 2024 growing season?
It wasn't a total shock. I mean, I think there was a hope that we could get through August before we started drying out. Sometimes that transition from El Nino to neutral or El Nino into La Nina can be a little problematic for our part of the country in terms of drought. So we definitely have seen some areas of the state with some flash drought development. Thankfully, it wasn't maybe as widespread as some other years. I mean, certainly not like 2022 or 2012, but in some places it's been kind of rough.
Well, it's foolish to paintbrush things and say the whole state of Nebraska is this way or that way, but in general, Eric, things have been unseasonably cooler here for the month of August and got a nice relief for a lot of people.
No, this is very true. That's actually probably one thing that has helped keep things from really going sideways with regard to drought, particularly in parts of southeastern Nebraska. We have been relatively cool here for the last 2 weeks. Now, that was after a stretch of time where it was warmer. But I think looking forward, though, we probably are going to have some heat here coming up the next several days. And then, I think September right now looks warmer than average, which again has been kind of typical for the last decade or so. The CPC is showing it being relatively warm and dry for the fall as a whole. So they are actually concerned about drought basically encroaching the entire state as we head into this winter.
Well, it's time for the Nebraska State Fair coming up this weekend, so the heat has to return there for a few days. That's seasonal.
Of course, yeah. I think that's like God's law that it has to be really hot, either fair or Husker Harvest Days or both.
Or both, absolutely. Okay, so let's look at kind of the fall outlook for a harvest as you look out to the 30 days. How are things shaping up, moisture as well as temperatures?
Well, the CPC is showing warmer and dry for September and October. Most of the indicators I would look at would probably kind of show that that's probably fairly accurate. Now, I think there is going to be chances that we will get at least some routine frontal passages that will have the chances of bringing in some precipitation, potentially even some heavier precipitation across parts of the central and eastern Nebraska as we head into September. So I don't think we're going to be just bone dry, but I do think that we probably will not have a significant frequency of precipitation. And we might have a couple of cooler spells, but I think the risk of an early frost is fairly low this year. And we probably will be generally above average as we head into the first part of October. So I think the outlook for harvest is mostly pretty good right now.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to some of the research now happening at this laboratory where we join you from. Researchers at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln discovered a new defect in cattle that can cause physical collapse when they exercise. One of the researchers on the project called in to help was Dr. Jessica Peterson. She joined me to share the latest information on this topic.
So we're talking about Shakey Calf Mutation. Set this up for us. What is it and how did you discover it?
Sure. So the Shakey Calf name was something that we just started calling it after we got a series of emails from folks here at Gudmundsen saying they had some calves that couldn't keep up with the herd. And they're moving pastures or something like that, and they look back and these calves were basically down. And at that time they're like, well, we're calling you or we're contacting you because we noticed a couple like this last year. And so there was kind of a trend. When we got a couple of these calves to Lincoln, we tried to replicate the exercise of moving pastures, and the calves really wouldn't move. I think they knew that was an issue for them. But when they would stop, they would tremble. So their muscles would tremble because their muscles were exhausted. And so that's how the name Shakey Calf got started. But because they had seen issues in the past calf crop and they were seeing some issues again, we started asking the question of, could this be genetic? So that's how I got involved as a geneticist of trying to answer that question. Is there a genetic mutation causative of this?
So that was the question. The answer, spoiler alert, ends up being
spoiler
yes.
Alert. Yes, there is.
How did you get to that answer?
So we were fortunate because we had genotype data on hand from actually all of the herd at that point. And we were able to do a broad scale analysis and say, what do these calves have that nobody else in the herd does? And that got us to a chromosome. That's not the answer yet. But then we were able to use whole genome sequence to actually look at every part of the genome, and we found a mutation in a gene called PYGM That's really important for the breakdown of glycogen, which is needed to create energy in the muscle of these calves. So we went from big scale genotype analysis to whole genome sequencing, fine scale, to find that mutation.
So with a genetic mutation, there's not necessarily something people can implement on their operation if they have the same challenge, but you all identified this is out there, and now you can inform producers to be watching for this, right?
Absolutely. So this has been traced back to a Red Angus AI bull. And so there is a commercial test that the Red Angus Association is working with Neogen to develop and make available to producers so they can know if their animals are carriers of this mutation.
Mm-hmm. Well, the behind the scenes of finding all this is fascinating to me, of the partnership too between the Gudmundsen and Sandhills laboratory. Hey, we noticed this, making the call for you to be involved in the project. Talk about the importance of having this laboratory here in the Sandhills to be able to detect things like this and then do the research.
One was that the folks at Gudmundsen noticed this and then connected it to what they had seen previously in only a couple calves that prior year. And then connecting that to researchers at UNL, I work with some veterinary diagnosticians who are excellent. So they're able to refine what are we seeing in the muscle. Like we did muscle biopsies, we looked at, after we harvested a few of these animals, we looked at those particular traits, and we were able to confirm that what our mutation is doing is in fact showing up in the proteins and in the muscle, and it makes sense. Beyond that, the meat scientists got involved. And that's something that I didn't expect in this particular case. But the fact that these animals can't break down glycogen for energy makes them dark cutters at the end of the day. So it's detrimental both to their well-being as calves and as growing animals. And then if they do finish, their meat quality is also affected.
Another thanks to Jessica for joining us out here at the laboratory. Well, folks, that is just about all the time we have for this week's broadcast of Market Journal. And a special thank you to everybody out here at the Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory for making this place our mobile studio for the day. If you weren't able to make it out here and you'd like to follow along with the various research events that are all happening, you can check out all the presentations from this year's event that will be posted on the homepage of the Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory website. If you didn't miss one of our stories throughout the show, or perhaps any of our coverage in years past, you can always check out the whole show or individual stories. We post those over on the Market Journal YouTube page. We hope to see you back here next time, but until then, I'm Bryce Duskett, wishing you a safe and productive week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.